tonight we're going to visit a couple of women. One is Jezebel. So what do people have as their image of Jezebel?
Oh, she's such a Jezebel. I mean, it's certainly not a complimentary. I don't know that they're ready to say she's a prostitute, but she's a pretty loose woman, or she's.
Oh, a loose woman. Interesting. Okay. What other images do you have of Jezebel? Hi, Sandy. Any other thoughts about Jezebel?
She's like a
Andrea,
siren
please,
who
Steve.
calls you off into different directions. And
Okay. Judy?
I'm just laughing. No, isn't there a term? I mean, a Jezebel, isn't that?
Okay, so I'm going to share with you the trailer for a movie called Jezebel with Betty Davis.
You're part of it, Pris. And it's part of you. Like I am. You can't get away from us, Pris. We're both in your blood.
Judy, please.
And we'll never let you go. To plan. To fight. But you can't fight marriage. Marriage, is it? To that washed out little Yankee. Pris is mine.
I expressed an opinion. There was nothing personal about it. Take it as you like.
Well, if it wasn't personal, I'm satisfied.
Just understand, Cantrell, the question of your being satisfied about my opinions is of no importance to me.
Gentlemen.
Evidently, you've made up your mind.
No, Julie. You've made up my mind.
Well, then, goodbye, Pris.
Okay, so as you can see from this little clip, you know, she's someone, she should have been whipped. I love that. She's got some relationship with Henry Font. Oops.
The 1970s were filled with celebrations for Betty. Her son, Michael Merrill, was married in Westport, Connecticut.
Sorry about that. So she had some relationship with the Henry Fonda character. I don't know what happened, but clearly he was pretty angry at her. And she tries to... There's a scene that I had also looked at, which was she was wearing this beautiful white dress, and she comes out. He comes back from far away, and she says, "Oh, I know you like me in white," and she's beautiful. And it turns out that she says, "Please forgive me for whatever," and he's just kind of. Wait a minute. Someone said no sound. Did you guys hear the clip?
Yes.
yes,
Sandy, you're having problems. I'm sorry. It's not us. It's you.
I did have to turn my audio much higher, much louder
Okay.
to hear it, but I heard it.
Good. Okay. Anyway, so she wears this beautiful white dress and she says, "Oh, please forgive me, thinking she's going to win his heart back. And he basically then kind of leaves the room and brings back this woman that he married. And she's just stunned. And when she leaves the room, she says to this other woman, "I've got to find a scheme to get him, and the woman says, "But he's married." She goes, "Oh, who cares?" So obviously breaking up a marriage with no morals, the whole thing. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to look at Jezebel. Okay, this is not the slide I want. Sorry. Okay, here we are. Jezebel. Temptress or religious fanatic is what we're going to call it. So we just saw this clip of Betty Davis as Jezebel. Obviously, it's, they called her Jezebel. Her name is Julie. So obviously Jezebel is a derogatory term. Here's a painting of her, looking like a vixen. And there's another movie, Sins of Jezebel, and she's wearing, it looks like horns on her head rather than a tiara. And her breasts look like they're weapons. And this is with Paulette Goddard. So here is the actual text of the story, which appears in 1 Kings. So, but then as if it had been a trifling thing for him to commit the sins of Jeroboam, Ahab took as his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. So Ahab is a king in the north, the country of Israel, before it was conquered and by the Assyrians. And actually, Ahab is not considered a wonderful guy by the Bible, because again, it was written, the Bible was ultimately written by Judah in the south, and so they get to say whatever they feel like about the north. And Ahab actually, he and his father established a long line of kingship. They were actually successful in holding on to their kingship for a long time. But as far as being someone who is faithful to God, to our God, Yahweh, no. So he takes this woman. Now, in those days, people married, just like later on as well, kings would marry the daughters of kings of other areas, right? To create a political alliance, to create an economic alliance. So he marries Jezebel, who's the daughter of a king of another country, and they serve Baal, Baal being, their god. And Jezebel happens to, of course, worship that god. And because Ahab loves her, he erects an altar for Baal, right? And Samaria is in the north, right? So Jezebel does a nasty thing, which is that she has the prophets of God, our God, killed. And what follows is the famous contest between the prophets of Baal and those of the God of Israel. Of course, the God of Israel wins. And Elijah, being the prophet of God, kills 850 of the pagan priests. And Ahab comes back and tells Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had put all the prophets to the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to say to Elijah, "May the gods do terrible things to me and worse ones besides, if by this time tomorrow I haven't taken your life, just as you took theirs." She's upset because her god is Baal, and the priests to Baal have now been murdered by Elijah. So this is what Alice Bellis has to say. She's a feminist writer. Up to this point, Jezebel is portrayed as a strong woman. She's locked in a very serious battle with Elijah over whose religion will prevail. Mutual tolerance is not a possibility for either of them. Both are committed to a battle to the death. Although we may prefer Elijah's God to Jezebel's, Elijah and Jezebel use the same means to accomplish their identical ends. She doesn't do anything, so terrible. I mean, Elijah kills 850 priests. She wants to kill Elijah. I mean, it's not as though she's doing anything that's out of the ordinary as far as her preserving her own religion. Now, here's a nasty thing that happens. A while later, an incident occurred involving Naboth. He owned a vineyard right next to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab spoke to Naboth and said, "Give me your vineyard so that I can have it as my vegetable garden, because it's close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you its monetary value." But Naboth said to Ahab, "Adonai forbid that I should give you my ancestral heritage." Ahab went home resentful and depressed at what Naboth had done. He lay down in his bed, turned his face away, and refused to eat. So here you have somebody with land that belonged to his family. He doesn't want to sell it. You could compare it to things that are going on now in Israel, you know, maybe a Palestinian land that settlers want to take. And the Palestinians are very, very committed to that land. So Ahab's depressed, right? I can't have what I want, like a spoiled brat, right? But Jezebel, his wife, went and said to him, why are you so depressed that you refuse to eat? Wait a minute. Okay, he answered her, because I spoke to Naboth, but he answered, I won't give you my vineyard. And she goes, well, are you the king of Israel or not? Asked his wife Jezebel. Get up, eat some food, and cheer up. I will give you the vineyard. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters to the leaders and notables of the city where Naboth lived. In the letters she wrote, proclaim a fast and give Naboth the seat of honor among the people. Have 2 good-for-nothing men sit opposite him, and have them accuse him of publicly cursing God and the king. Then take him outside and stone him to death. All right, before we keep going, I want to just ask you, does this sound familiar? Is there any other story where something like this happens?
Doesn't David do the same thing with a...
Beautiful. And we're going to look at that in a moment. So David does something very similar. Also, if you think about the story of Purim and Esther, Esther wants to trap Haman. And so what does she do? She prepares a big fancy meal, a big fancy a big fancy, festive party, because that's what her husband Ahasuerus likes, and that speaks right to his heart. And that's how she's going to trap Haman. I mean, she's not doing anything underhanded like Jezebel is. But anyway, the point is, he's going to have the seat of honor, and they're going to be 2 guys who are going to basically be hauled in to accuse him of doing something really bad, which is cursing God and the king. And then, of course, they're going to have to take him outside and stone him to death. The leaders and notables of the city he lived in did as Jezebel had written in the letter she sent to them, then sent a message to Jezebel. Naboth has been stoned to death. So, in order to get this vineyard that he wants, she finds a way to get the guy killed so that she can take his property, right?
And I have a question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Jezebel, who isn't a believer in the God of Israel, seems to have a lot of power all of a sudden, and the leaders are following her.
She's the queen. I mean, she's married to the king of Israel, right? Ahab is the king. And so now she doesn't have the power to say, Naboth, give me your land. But she does have the power to, get him, to trick him into being stoned to death.
And obviously to write letters to leaders.
Well, she used her husband's signature. She didn't use her own.
Okay.
Right? So, but he's obviously kind of weak on some level, even though he was a successful king and ruled for like 50 years or something. But in any event, as far as the vineyard that he wants, he's just pouting and acting like a baby.
And an attempt at humor, Nebish is quite close to Naboth.
What is? Nebish? I don't know if there's a relationship.
I doubt it. One's Hebrew and
one's Yiddish, yeah. So let's see what happens. Okay. So the leaders and notables of the city he lived in did as Jezebel had written in the letters, right? They sent the message and they said he's been stoned to death. When Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard, because Naboth is no longer alive. He is dead." When Ahab heard that, he set out to the vineyard to take possession of it. But the word of Adonai came to Elijah from Tishbe. "Get up, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who lives in Samaria. Right now he is in the vineyard of Naboth. This is what you are to say to him. Here's what Adonai says. You have committed murder, and now you are stealing the victim's property. Also say to him, here's what Adonai says. In the very place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, dogs will lick up your blood. Yours. Okay. All right, we're going to get to David and Bathsheba in a moment. But, so, really, we're going to hear about the end of Jezebel, but that's really pretty much the whole story of Jezebel. So, she's not a prostitute, and she's not a lot of the things she's been, characterized as. She's not, necessarily the nicest person, but again, she's doing exactly the same thing that Elijah was doing, right? Elijah killed the prophets of the opposite God, and she wants to kill him. Why is Elijah any better than she is? Any thoughts about that? I mean, Elijah is yeah?
Would you say her value system is as good as Elijah's?
Well, she's serving a different God. Now, we think our God is better. At least in this period, we're really not yet at the point where there's only one God. Because in the Bible, we sort of go from people believing in many gods to believing that our God is the best to eventually believing there's only one. So we're not quite there yet. It's called monolatry as opposed to, monotheism. So
could we say she started this? Because could we say that she started this by killing God's prophets?
Well, no. Elijah killed them first. They had a contest, right? They had a contest to see who would, get this fire pan lit up, and he,
right.
And
he poured water on it.
Exactly. He poured water on it, and then Elijah's God won the contest. And
I thought that she had been killing the prophets, Elijah's prophets, before he did that.
Well, that is possible. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember if she did that. If he did.
Rabbi, that's the way it read, at least as I remember in the slides you used.
Yeah.
That she killed, was it 150 or?
Oh, maybe you're right. Yeah, you're right.
So as the kids would stay in the schoolyard, you started it.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But it says okay. Yeah, all right. So, I'm not saying it was a good thing that she killed the prophets, but does that justify Elijah killing 750 of hers?
But
yeah?
Was it Katie who recommended James Kugel's book?
Yes.
Thank you. Again, I bought it. I've been reading it, and it makes me want to ask, okay, this was probably written about a lot later than when it happened, and what was the purpose of the people writing about it at the time that they wrote about it, which was not necessarily a time, or unlikely to be a time, in which two gods, exist and they're somehow equal. I mean, we look at it with our modern perspective and we say, this looks like, why does one God have superiority to the other? They're each acting in the name of their God. Why does one have divine approval and the other not? But from the point of view of people who wrote it later on, aren't they just trying to say, this is how things turn out? Our God's more important.
Wasn't human sacrifice part of worshiping Baal?
Yes. And by the way, you're right. She did kill the prophets first. But, again, first of all, because she killed them doesn't mean that it's justified for Elijah to do it. And all I'm not saying that she's the paragon of virtue. I'm just simply saying the way she was portrayed later, especially, in popular culture, is not really reflective of what the story is about. She's a tough cookie. Yeah, Alejandra.
I just keep thinking about how sexualized she is and how I was expecting that in the story. Like I was expecting an element of the story where she's like whipping up her breasts, but that's not there.
No.
So I'm just really interested in how, like, to villainize her, she gets sexualized. You know, Elijah doesn't get sexualized. Maybe he should have, but I'm just, that to me is so interesting that the vilification doesn't come from her strength, but from her sexuality.
Well, and the same thing happened with Delilah. I mean, Delilah, you know, she tells the guy 4 times, this is what I'm going to do. And, you know, he goes ahead and does it, you know, does exactly what, you know, she asked him to do, which is tell me where your strength comes from. So it's just interesting to see how a story that, I mean, I didn't give you the entire story, but it's pretty close. How does that, you know, of course she's an enemy in the sense that she's supporting Baal, but remember, Solomon married, what, 700 women? And brought worship of all sorts of other gods into the community as well. And so he was condemned for that. And the only reason she's really condemned is because she represents a different religion.
What I think is interesting, though, is that she is worshiping Baal, who is a god of fertility and also rain. And they're in a time of drought. And then she ends up all of a sudden, out of nowhere, being sexualized.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wasn't Baal requiring human sacrifices, though?
Yeah, there was. I mean, I'm not saying Baal was a great god or that, but it's just a different system, a different religion, one that we don't particularly like. We came up with something different with a different set of ethics and morality, but you know.
Well, I was thinking maybe David was behaving like a thug, but he wasn't a mass murderer.
Well, again, I'm not saying that worship of Baal is a good thing. And I'm not saying, you know, they're equal religions, but I'm just saying that in the context here, she's not really being such a terrible, horrible vixen, you know, prostitute, whatever, right? I mean, she's the queen and she gets what she wants, which her husband apparently is not able to do. I'm not saying she does it in a good way. But let's look at David for a minute now, you know, and see why he's such a great guy. Here we are. Okay, so here's David, and there's a war going on. And when there's a war going on, you're supposed to be with your people, your army, right? And he's not. He's in Jerusalem. And that's a first no-no. And he looks over and sees this beautiful woman that he wants, just the way Naboth wants the vineyard. I see it, I want it, okay? So, now here's Bathsheba being portrayed as a vixen also, when actually David's the one who sees her from the balcony and she's just minding her own damn business. Okay, so King David is walking on the roof of his palace. He sees Bathsheba, who is married to Uriah. Okay, she's having a bath. It's probably a mikveh. And he immediately desires her and brings her over. They sleep together. He makes her pregnant. Well, he doesn't want this to come out, right? So he summons Uriah from the army in the hope that Uriah would reconsummate his marriage and think that the child was his. Now, Uriah is unwilling to violate the ancient kingdom rule applying to warriors in active service. When you're in active service, you do not have sex. So he says, I'm not going to go home to my own bed. I'm going to remain with Hal's troops. So he does not go and sleep with his wife. So then what David does is the next day he gives him a lot of wine and hopes that with all that wine in him, he's going to be willing to go and sleep with his wife. But Uriah refuses again. So David gives an order to his general Joab with a letter, just the way Jezebel did, saying that this guy Uriah should be placed in the front lines of the battle. And of course that's the most dangerous place, and left to the hands of the enemy, where he is more likely to die. And by the way, Uriah has to carry this message to Joab, the general. that is the order for his own death. And of course, he does get killed in battle. So now David marries Bathsheba. David's action is displeasing to God, who accordingly sends Nathan the prophet to reprove the king. So just the way we have the prophet Elijah going to Ahab saying, you did a really bad thing, and he tells him a similar parable. He says, there's a rich man who takes away the one little ewe lamb of his poor neighbor, right? Just the way this poor guy Naboth had a vineyard, and just that's the one thing that the king wanted, even though the king had lots of other things. And he says this, you know, David says, oh, this is really bad that this, you know, rich guy takes the ewe lamb from the poor neighbor. What has Nathan said to him? Here's the story. There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. So this is not just some, you know, lamb that's going to be eaten or whatever. This is really like a pet. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. This is a story that Nathan is telling David. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. Okay, so we're going to skip the movie, and before we go on to see what happens to Jezebel, I just want to say, what exactly is the difference between what David did and what Jezebel did? David's supposed to be the king of the golden age of Israel, from whom the Messiah is going to come.
David's a little more subtle, but the result is the same.
Yeah. They both take something that is not to be taken. They don't need it. And to get it, they do very underhanded things, which results in murder, basically. In David's case, it's also adultery. So, of course, the baby that Bathsheba has in this case dies. That's the punishment.
Could I ask a question about Bathsheba?
Yeah.
When he sees her bathing, is she bathing on the roof?
Supposedly.
Wouldn't she be seen by a lot of people on the roof?
You know, it certainly isn't a modest way to bathe. I'm not sure exactly why, you know, she's doing it that way, but that's the story. I was going to say Bathsheba, later, if we were studying David and all his wives, she's the mother of Solomon. And when David's old and there's a fight over who's going to succeed him, like which of the sons, she maneuvers it so that Solomon becomes his successor. So she doesn't end up just being a little shrinking violet. But that's for another class. So, you know, David... Yeah.
Nor is Jezebel in the story.
I'm sorry?
They're aggressive go-getters, both women.
Well, yeah, Bathsheba becomes an aggressive go-getter. In the case of this story here, she's just an object. But she finds her voice, shall we say. So at the end of David's life, what happens, he's had a lot of wives. And they serve different purposes. And at the end of his life, he is, you know, old and cold, and they get him a prostitute just to cover him like a blanket. So it's not a sexual thing at all. And then Bathsheba maneuvers to get Solomon to be the successor. So let's see how Jezebel ends. And remember, this is a story written by the South, Judah. They don't like the North, because the North split away from them and established a different temple up there in Samaria. And they had all these kings who married other wives and were not faithful to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Adonai. And here's Jezebel, who's tempted her husband into worshiping Baal. So she cannot end well. And she ends really horribly. So when Jehu came to Jezreel, just the area, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head, and looked out the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she says, "Is it well, Zimri, your master's murderer?" Then he lifted up his face to the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 officials looked down at him. He said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses. And he trampled her underfoot. When he came in, he ate and drank, and he said, "See now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." They went to bury her, but they found nothing more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hand. That's pretty hideous. And then Jehu becomes the king. But so, she's trying to, at this point, I would say, yes, she's trying to, look pretty and whatever to try to seduce him so he doesn't, get after her. But, up until that point, that's not really who she is. And they threw her out the window, and, dogs basically eat most of her body. And the prophecy comes true that the blood of Ahab's family is going to be scattered on the ground. So that's her awful ending. So let's see what the rabbis do with her. Ugh, what in the hell? I don't know what just happened. Oy. Okay, let me try that again. What happened to...
Try unsharing.
Yeah, I have to go.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what just happened, but something, I hit the wrong button. All right, now I'm going to try to share again. Here we go. Get rid of this thing. All right. So before we get to what the rabbis have to say, here is Jezebel being thrown out the window. So here is a theory about why she's even included in the story. This is by a woman named Carrie Walsh from Villanova University. Why is it that she's even in the Bible? The memory of Jezebel served an important multifaceted function for the community's formation of identity. Okay, this is in Yehud, Judah. First, she baldly represented the negative for that community, what they were not, what they agreed they would not be. The figure of Jezebel provided the important outer boundary for who Israel was. So again, Israel is forming a new identity as a nation, as a people, and they're constantly having to say the surrounding culture is not who we are. And so they always find a very kind of almost brutal way of talking about the culture around them and how everybody has to be destroyed and their worship places need to be destroyed. She clarified precisely where that line was for a community struggling to recast its understanding of itself, still as Israel in the post-exilic world. This negative reinforcement occurred in at least 2 ways. First, a sense of social cohesion was enhanced by the shared disgust her story elicited, which I'm sure seeing her as a vixen and as a prostitute serves a purpose for our culture, right? This is the kind of woman you shouldn't be. You should be the nice mother and, non-sexual person. But in the time of Israel, in the early days, we all look at her and go, ooh, she's awful. She represents this terrible god, Baal. She's the most reviled character in the Hebrew Bible. A more nuanced portrayal might well have split hearers in their reaction to her, but not so with the Deuteronomistic history's colorful character study in nastiness. Jezebel was the queen everyone could hate. So, they don't try to make her seem like a good person, even though if we look at it intratextually, we see that David did the same thing. Secondly, hearing Jezebel's evil escapades would occasion further somber reflection on the limitations of political autonomy itself. Remembering Jezebel, the Omrids, so Omri was Ahab's father, and that's the line, that the dynasty that was established in the north. And the entire line of wicked kings recalled that monarchic self-rule was fraught with dangers, corruption, and risk. And the community would likely view monarchic rule itself as fragile, since it had lost both northern and southern kingdoms in its past, and more recently had witnessed the fall of Babylon to Persia. So, of course, all of this is edited later on in Babylonia after the Israelites are kicked out of the land. And they have to look back at their history and say, well, maybe monarchy wasn't such a good idea after all. Ideologically, such critical memory engendered acceptance of the community's present circumstances. So maybe it's better to live in exile as a kind of semi-autonomous community, because when we had a king, look what we did. We really abused the privilege. So the rabbis have their own views of Jezebel. The Jerusalem Talmud relates that when Rabbi Levi would expound, indeed there never was anyone like Ahab who committed himself to doing what was displeasing to the Lord. He would censure Ahab's conduct, since this verse attests that none of all the kings of Israel had committed acts as notorious as those of Ahab. So again, kings like Ahab and other kings who were successful politically and militarily but not religiously pure, they really hate. And a king like Hezekiah or a king like Josiah, who were both militarily not successful, are lauded for their purity of the way they tried to conduct the religion. At night, Ahab came to Rabbi Levi and asked him, this is like in a dream, how have I sinned against you, and what crimes have I committed against you? Why do you read only the beginning of the verse and not its end that says, at the instigation of his wife Jezebel? Of course, it's her fault, just like Adam blamed Eve. That woman you gave me, that's why I ate from the tree. From that day forth, Rabbi Levi portrayed Ahab in a positive light when he expounded the verse. For all of the kings of Israel who had irked the Lord, Ahab was the only one whose wife had provoked him to do so. Of course, Ahab would have done nothing wrong had it not been for her. Now, I'm sure she did influence him, but, let's take some responsibility for one's own actions. Corresponding to the 6 months during which Rabbi Levi had elucidated the verse as defamatory of Ahab, he then expounded it for 6 months as praise of the monarch. So as long as we can make Jezebel be the bad guy, Ahab is okay. But despite their negative description of Jezebel, the rabbis did not refrain from enumerating her merits when she was worthy of praise. When Elijah forecasts Jezebel's end, he prophesies, the dog shall devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel. This prophecy is only partially fulfilled, for when her body is eaten by the dogs, they leave her feet and hands. The Midrash explains that these parts remained because of the acts of kindness that Jezebel performed with them. Now that's really a shock that the rabbis would find some way to say that she was actually not so bad after all. I mean, these are different rabbis from the ones who hate her. I mean, obviously, consistency is not part of the Jewish tradition. Jezebel's home was close to the marketplace, and whenever a funeral procession passed by, she would come forth from her house, strike with her hands, lament with her mouth, and walk 10 paces. When a bridegroom passed through the marketplace, she would come out, clap her hands, call out with her mouth, and walk 10 steps after him. This account teaches that God rewards good deeds, even in a wicked woman, since the limbs that performed laudable acts were the recipient of divine loving kindness. So because her feet and her hands didn't get eaten by the dogs, that's some sort of wonderful reward. Okay. So that's pretty weird, I have to say. I can understand Rabbi Levi saying she, led her husband to do all these really terrible things, but the ones who say that actually she wasn't so bad after all because she did these kindnesses and she accompanied a bride and she accompanied a funeral procession, which are 2 mitzvot that we're supposed to do, that somehow that's why her hands and feet were left. And any thoughts about the rabbi's reactions to her?
Was she supposed to appreciate this act of
Well, by that point, I don't think there was much left to appreciate what happened, but maybe her children did. I don't know.
If I were ever in a situation like that, I'd probably say, go ahead and take my hands and feet too. At this point, I haven't got any use for them.
Really, really. So you see how the rabbis can take a tiny little thing and make it into something. Judy.
Yeah, no, just reiterating what was just said. I mean, what comfort is it that her hands and feet are left?
Yeah. So, small comfort for the poor woman. Okay, now, any more comments about her before we move on to another lady? Okay, so I thought we'd take a look at another wife of David. Her name is Abigail, or Gail in English. And she's a very unusual person. And now we'll see, okay, so you have to understand that David, he kept trying to kill Saul. Saul was the king. David kept trying to kill him. Saul kept trying to kill David. I'm sorry. And, yeah. And David actually had the opportunity at one point to kill Saul himself because David was hiding in a cave and Saul came to take a pee. And David was in the cave and really could have easily killed him, instead of which he just cut off a piece of his robe and showed it to him to say, look, I mean, he didn't say it in so many words, but basically what he was saying is, I could have killed you, but I didn't, right? So, anyway, but Saul was a little crazy, and Saul just kept trying to kill David, and eventually David has to flee. So he goes to the south, to Judah, and he becomes kind of a brigand, and he runs a protection racket. Seriously. So he goes around to different people and says, you take care of me and my men, you'll be okay. Maybe give us some money or give us some food or this or that, but otherwise, we kill you. Again, our great King David. So now he's going to go and do this to another person.
Rabbi?
Yes.
His lifestyle, David's lifestyle, if my memory serves me correctly, was because his brothers cast him. Am I mixing up the stories?
Well, he was the youngest brother.
Yeah.
He killed Goliath. Saul said, whoever kills Goliath gets to marry my daughter. But then he changed his mind.
Right, but when David's a brigand, as you say, that's when he's cast, like Joseph was and his brothers. David was thrown out.
I think it's more because Saul wants to kill him.
Okay. All right.
And he's got to watch out.
Okay.
And he's, he does marry Saul's daughter, and there's a whole thing around that, and we can do a whole thing on David. But anyway, right now he's in the south being a bad guy. Well, kind of not such a great guy, let's put it that way. Okay, so I've got to get rid of this floating thing every single time. Okay, so we're going to look at Abigail. Wait a minute. Is that where? Okay, so here's the story. There's a certain man in Ma'on who had property in Carmel who was very wealthy. This is going to sound like a similar story. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal. Now, Nabal is connected to a word that means confused. And his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours.'" It's a nice way of saying hello before saying, "Give me your stuff." "Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. In other words, hi, how you doing? You know, peace be upon you. We treated your people very well, and therefore, please give us some food and some provisions. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. So, in other words, the answer... Can you hang on just 1 second? Oh, please. I don't have kids to annoy me during a service or a class. I have animals. Okay. So, basically, the servants come back and they say, you know, he's not going to give us anything. And David gets angry. He says, each of you strap on your sword. So they did, and David strapped his on as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. So he's ready to go, you know, kill this guy for not having, you know, shared his bounty with him. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent messengers in the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." So the servants are saying, you know, these guys, David's guys, were pretty good to us. You know, why start this big fight? Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband. These women are smart enough to do stuff without necessarily telling their husbands. So she's bringing a whole bunch of stuff to David, right? As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive 1 male of all who belong to him." So here's David being an impulsive jerk. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before him. So she's really smart. She's coming with lots of provisions. She kneels down to him, which of course Nabal was not willing to do. He's saying, who's this guy? Who cares? She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my lord be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has fulfilled for my lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my lord success, remember your servant." All right, what is she saying to him? What is Abigail saying to David?
trying to prevent him from doing something catastrophic.
Why? What is her argument? What's her argument? Why should he not do that?
Because in the long run, God will reward him if he avoids taking revenge.
That's one reason that, God will reward him in the long run. What else?
Didn't she also say that he didn't know about this at the beginning?
He didn't what?
That she wasn't aware of.
Oh, she said she wasn't aware, right? So
she wasn't aware,
right? So Nabal answered you foolishly, but I'm going to take care of this. Okay. What else? Very important thing that she says to him. She's basically saying, look, you're going to become a king. You cannot have blood on your hands. Okay? She's looking out for his political interests. She's very smart this way. Look, you're going to become the king. You cannot do this. Get blood on your hands, mess up your reputation, right? Because there's a great future for you ahead. Don't mess it up. So she's smart, she's rich, she's undoubtedly beautiful. What happens? Okay, so David says, thank you so much. May you be blessed for your good judgment in keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. So, okay, so she takes care of this. Like, okay, there's not going to be any bloodshed. David's not going to have blood on his hands. Her husband and all the people, the servants, are not going to be killed. That would be a nice ending, right? But there's more. Here, by the way, interrupted for a moment to see a picture. Here she is with her sheep and all her provisions, bowing down to David, asking him to, do the right thing. And here's another representation of him. She's not as attractive in this one, but it's more medieval looking painting. Here she is looking a little more like a beautiful woman. All right, let me get rid of this. Oh, wait, the rabbis. Okay, wait a second. Right floating. Okay. The rabbis tell how Abigail managed to conduct a weighty discussion with David. She came to him on a pretext. Okay, this is funny, the way she came to him on a pretext. Asking him to rule whether she was pure or impure after her menstruation. So just imagine that, well, this is what, that women do this. They go to a rabbi to find out if they're pure after menstruation. David is no rabbi or even a priest. But supposedly, this is why she came to him. And they deduce this from the verse, she was riding on the ass and going down the covert of the mountain. That is, she addressed him concerning covert things, namely questions concerning menstruation. David told her, can blood be seen at night? Menstrual blood must be seen in the daylight. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Abigail also responded on matters of blood. So she's asking him about menstruation to introduce the subject of blood. And they're having a little discussion about it. And then she says, as long as we're talking about blood, our capital case is judged at night, because David had come to kill her husband Nabal at night. The decision in capital cases must be rendered in daylight. David replied, since I am king and Nabal refuses my orders, he is deemed to be rebelling against the king, and as such may be put to death without a trial. Abigail retorted, Saul still reigns, and you are not the ruler. Your coin bearing your name, declaring you be king, has not yet been issued. This argument won over David, and he conceded to Abigail, and blessed be your prudence. So they're supposedly having a whole legalistic argument here. And he thinks he's already king, and she says, yeah, you're not king yet, so, don't do it. And the rabbis include Abigail among the foremost beautiful women who ever lived. The mere thought of her, even without seeing her, inspired lust. She's also mentioned among the 7 women prophets of Israel. Although the Bible does not depict her as such, Abigail's entreaty to David in 1 Samuel which forecasts his military victory over his enemies and his future as king of Israel, was perceived as prophecy. Since she was blessed with divine inspiration, the rabbis learned of the afterlife from what Abigail pronounced. She tells David, "The life of my Lord will be bound up in the bundle of life," from which the rabbis derive that God bundles up the souls of the righteous with pleasure and honor. Now, the story of David and Abigail and the episode of David and Bathsheba did not escape the rabbis. Now, I just want to see if because I think it does. Okay, I guess not. All right. So, the rabbis, of course, see David and Abigail getting together at night as an event with adulterous potential. Somebody needs to mute themselves because I'm reverberating. I think it might be you, Patty. Can you? Thank you. The rabbis relate that Abigail's thigh was revealed to David. He lusted after her, and he went after her for 3 parasangs. David said to Abigail, "Heed me, lie with me," to which she replied, "Do not let this be a cause of stumbling. This should not be a stumbling block and a cause of transgression for you." So in other words, he committed adultery with Bathsheba. By the way, Abigail is before Bathsheba. And she is stopping him from committing adultery and murder, unlike what he does with Bathsheba, right? And David did indeed heed her and overcame his evil inclination. After this he blessed Abigail, and blessed be you yourself for restraining me from seeking redress in blood. The rabbis learned from the plural, because blood is damim, not dam, that she saved him from 2 transgressions, from committing bloodshed and from having relations with her when she was menstrually impure. Where they get the menstruation, I don't know, but in any event.
I mean, it's okay when she's not menstruating impure.
Right. Well, it would have been bad if she had committed adultery, but certainly much worse if she was menstruating at the time. Okay? They're looking at the word blood, bloods. It's like when Cain kills Abel, and then God says, Abel's bloods are crying out to me. It's in the plural. So the rabbis say, why is it in the plural? Because it's not just Abel, but all his descendants. And here they're saying, why is it plural for damim? It's because it's not only the blood of killing Nabal and all his men, but it's also the menstrual blood. They have a very rich imagination, as you know. Before taking her leave of David, Abigail tells him, "And when the Lord has prospered, my Lord, remember your maid." She says that to him, remember. The rabbis respond to this with a popular saying, "While a woman talks, she spins," which praises woman's ability to engage simultaneously in 2 activities that require one's attention. Abigail was indeed blessed with this trait, characteristic of women. She engaged in her husband's affairs and tried to save his life, while at the same time she wisely laid the foundation for the future by asking that David favorably remember her for her actions. Some rabbis apply another proverb to this. The goose stoops as it goes along, but its eyes gaze afar. This saying describes the nature of the goose, to forage for food on the ground with stooped head, but at the same time its eyes are located on the sides of its head. They look around to ensure that no danger lurks. Thus Abigail engaged in the immediate concern, saving her family from David's sword, while at the same time looking into the future and preparing her household accordingly. I'm not sure this is a complete compliment that she's able to do 2 things at the same time, because, I don't know, geese are not the smartest animals, and comparing her to a goose, I wouldn't say is a great compliment, but, oh, oops, okay, now, what happens, screen share to stop, good, okay, what happens at the end here is very interesting, because while she has stopped him from committing murder and adultery and having sex with someone when they're menstruating, when Nabal hears what happened, that she gave all of this stuff to her husband, to David, that her husband's stuff was given to David, he has a heart attack and dies. Conveniently enough, and guess what? David marries her. And so now David has a beautiful, smart, politically savvy, rich wife to add to his harem. Because the first wife he has is Michal, who happens to be Saul's daughter. So he's married into the royal family, just like certain people marry into certain dynasties today. And now he has the legitimacy of, even though he's not Saul's son, he's got the legitimacy of being married into the royal family. So he now has a politically expedient marriage, a marriage with someone who's smart and rich. Then he'll marry Bathsheba, a whole other story, and he'll have various other wives. So in this particular instance, because Abigail is so sort of politically savvy and smart and on top of things, he gets a really good match here. And he doesn't commit all these terrible crimes that he committed with Bathsheba, or that, you know, others have committed, you know, in these circumstances. So, any comments about Abigail? No? Okay, so last lady we're going to look at. Huldah. Have to remember Huldah. Okay, let me oh, wait a second. Gotta get her. Okay, I'm going to okay, here she is. And okay, this is a little known woman in the Bible. I've mentioned her before. So this is King Josiah, who's one of the good kings, right? And he has his high priest, Hilkiah, restore the temple, which has fallen into disrepair. And in the process, this high priest discovers an unknown scroll of the Torah. And this is the book of Deuteronomy. When it's read aloud to the king, he realizes that Israel has not been faithful to God, and he tears his clothing in mourning. Now, he has to authenticate this scroll because who knows where this thing came from. So he sends the high priest to authenticate the scroll and make sure that it is indeed the word of God. So Hilkiah, the high priest, went to Huldah the prophet. She's the wife of Shallum, the keeper of the wardrobe, and spoke with her. And she says, Adonai, the God of Israel, says to tell the man who sent you to me that Adonai says this: I am going to bring calamity on this place and on its inhabitants, every word in the scroll the king of Judah has read, because they have abandoned me and offered to other gods. So you get in the Deuteronomic history, which is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, the 2 books of Samuel and the 2 books of Kings, you get wonderful, supposedly, you know, wonderful kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who are very faithful to God, interspersed with guys who aren't so great, and where the Israelites will continually start worshiping other gods, and then bad things happen to them. They get punished for that. So this is what's happened before Josiah came along. And so God is really annoyed. They've abandoned me. They've offered to other gods to provoke me. And so my anger is going to burn against this place and will not be quenched. But you are to tell the king of Judah who sent you to consult Adonai that Adonai, the God of Israel, also says this: in regard to the words you have heard, because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before Adonai when you heard what I said against this place and its inhabitants, that they would become an object of astonishment and cursing, and have torn your clothes and cried before me, I've also heard you, says Adonai. So because Josiah reads this and goes into mourning and wants to reform the cult, therefore I will gather you to your ancestors. You will go to your grave in peace, and your eyes will not see all the calamity I'm going to bring to you this place. So Josiah is going to be okay because he has recognized the terrible sins that have occurred. And so they go back to Josiah and they tell him this. There's Huldah looking at the scroll and authenticating it. Now, by the way, before we go on to the rabbinic views, that is all that we get about Huldah. That is it. So what do you think the rabbis do with that? All right, it'll be a mystery until we solve it right here.
Rabbi?
Yes. Go ahead.
Is it common for a woman to be a prophet? Are there other...
Devorah was a prophet. Miriam was a prophet. There are prophetesses in the Bible. So there aren't as many as there are male prophets, but there certainly are women who are prophets.
So what makes a woman a prophet then? I mean, Miriam has her own fame as the sister of Moses.
Well, a prophet is someone who communicates with God.
Okay.
They don't predict the future. They, although they might say, okay, here's a message from God. You've been bad, you're going to be punished.
Okay.
And the prophet also often will intervene with God to try to allay God's anger, but a prophet is someone who has a communication with God. How do we know if someone's an authentic prophet? That's a good question. But she is definitely considered a prophet. Okay, so let's see what the rabbis have to do with her. Okay, so after Josiah finds his copy of the Torah in the temple, he consults Huldah rather than Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is around at the time. According to the rabbinic view, he felt that a woman would be more compassionate and more likely to intercede with God on his behalf. So in other words, again, a prophet is an intercessor between God and the people. So one view is that if they'd gone to Jeremiah, maybe Jeremiah wouldn't have been as, able to get God to calm down. Since Jeremiah was a kinsman of the prophetess, both being descended from Joshua and Rahab, the king felt no apprehension that the prophet would resent his preference for Huldah. In other words, she's a cousin or something, so Jeremiah wouldn't feel, slighted. While Jeremiah admonished and preached repentance to the men, she did likewise to the women. Okay, the N is missing from women, but we'll add that later. But then, of course, we have rabbis who charge Huldah with acting arrogantly when she told King Josiah's emissaries, "Say to the man who sent you." She should have honored the king and said to his representatives, "Say to the king." Because of her haughty deportment, she was given a denigratory name, Huldah, meaning weasel. And even the Aramaic translation of her name, Karkushta, sounds ugly. So that's another rabbinic view. One is that she was going to be more compassionate. This one is that she's a weasel. And then we have Huldah living in Jerusalem in the Mishnah. And we have the Targum, which is the translation into Aramaic, saying study hall, academy, a place of Torah. So she was living apparently in an academy, so she was very, very well versed in Torah and Torah law. Another view is that she taught the oral law to the elders of the generation. According to another tradition, she would preach in public and expound all the subjects mentioned twice in the Torah, and revealed the punishments for those who act counter to the allusions and hidden things in the Torah. Now, I say remember Huldah, but by the way, one of the things that the rabbis say is it wasn't her, it was her husband who actually was the prophet, once again. But that's one view among many that aren't so terrible, because the rabbis also say that she was a prophet who went around teaching the oral law, which is the interpretation of the Torah. So that's not so terrible. So
the keeper of the wardrobe was a prophet?
He was her husband, and just like, remember with Barak, who was the general who wouldn't even go to battle if Devorah wouldn't even go with him. they said it was really Barak who was the, guy who was able to win in battle. Or maybe it was her husband, whatever, that Barak was her husband. So they also often will, consider that it's a husband who really was the one, not. But it's very clear that she was the one who authenticated the scroll. So those are the ladies that we are examining in this course. So we had Eve, we had Jezebel, we had Delilah, we had Hagar, Huldah, Abigail. So after seeing all these women, what do you conclude from this?
They had power in their own right.
They did. And I mean, we could have also, there are lots of other women to look at. For example, Sarah and Abraham. Even though Abraham is the patriarch, Sarah is able to, first of all, the next patriarch is going to come through her. That's the measure of who's going to be the next patriarch. It's not just because it's from Abraham. Otherwise, Ishmael could have been the next patriarch. Also, when they go down to Egypt and Abraham says, pretend that you're my sister so that the Pharaoh doesn't kill him. He says to her, please pretend that you're my sister, or say that you're my sister. He asks her. It's a solicitousness that exists between them. Of course, he goes and tries to kill his son without telling her, but that's another story. Rebecca, the next matriarch, is the one who manipulates the situation so that Jacob becomes the next patriarch, right? She manipulates it by getting him to get the blessing of the firstborn, by having him pretend that he is Esau. And of course, then we have Rachel and Leah, who are the mothers of the 12 tribes. And frankly, even though there is definitely rivalry, and there's been sibling rivalry all throughout Genesis, the sisters do cooperate at a certain point, because Leah is the unfavored wife. Rachel is the favored wife. And Jacob has many children, many more children with Leah than he does with Rachel. But Leah's son finds a mandrake, which is supposedly something that allows you to be fertile. And Rachel says to Leah, please let me have the mandrake, because she wants to have a child. She's been barren, of course, like all these women are barren until God opens their womb. And Leah goes, well, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the mandrake if you let me sleep okay. If you let me sleep with Jacob, I will give you the mandrake. So they sort of make a trade. And even though they were very competitive at first, they do end up cooperating in terms of, how they're going to relate to their mutual husband. So there is a kind of evolution in the way in which siblings relate to each other, and it's certainly particularly different when it comes to how the women relate to each other as sisters. So the women don't have authority, but they have power. In other words, they don't have the official position, but they have ways in which they can manipulate a situation or drive a situation. And it's the way people who are out of power, official power, are able to do things. They do it in an underhanded way, because that's all you can do, right? You trick somebody. It's the trickster story for people who are out of power. And that's how it is, right? So these women are not, they're not like oppressed and, badly treated and, pathetic or, prostitutes or whatever. I really think that if you look at these women, and there are many more, but, these are the ones we handled in 4 sessions, I think you can see that they're women that we can admire on a certain level and respect on a certain level.
I look at this and I also think of it because it is women who have power but aren't necessarily in places of leadership. They aren't people with pathos. They're not the lower, doing something of a lowly position within society. And I think there's a lot of interesting components to other literary traditions as well throughout the world. When I'm thinking of like certain aspects of Celtic literature, or even some of the more like Norse literature as well, with this ability of women to go ahead and not necessarily serve as leaders. So there are examples of leaders in those traditions, but how much influence women did have, even though we often look back at it from a societal perspective and assume that there is no power because they're not in leadership roles. You don't have necessarily a queen in many of these traditions. Yet at the same time, the power and what winds up how they exert that power to influence leadership and ultimately influence the way of things is extreme. So I think that's an interesting component. So
I think you see a lot of the same thing in Shakespeare. Women who
Lady
have no
Macbeth.
power,
Lady
but
Macbeth,
exerted with wiles or whichever way they can do it.
Right. And that's always what happens to people who are not in power. You know, that's how they do it.
You just invented it.
Well, I would think that in the case of Huldah, she must have had at least some sort of power, since they went to her rather than the other prophets.
True. Yeah. When you're in a position of being a prophet, yeah, you do have a position of authority. Just like Devorah did. I mean, they're not all out of positions of authority, but it just, you know, I think, again, the culture has understood these women in a certain way, and then when you look at the actual text, you see that it's a complete interpretation. Yeah, Alejandra.
Well, I wonder, I have to get going to put my kids to bed, but I keep wondering about how we treat this as sort of exceptional. We think of Huldah and Deborah as exceptional because those are the snippets we have. But that also, you know, like we have made them extraordinary. Perhaps a lot of it doesn't read as extraordinary in the text. It just reads like, hey, I went to her because that's what I was supposed to do. So like, it's a very normalized thing that we have, as time gone on, looked to make them extraordinary. And I think there's a disconnect there about we are looking for examples, but perhaps in their time, it was just what it was. And we have missed that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you know, Abraham and Sarah, Rebecca and Jacob. I mean, Rebecca and Isaac. I'm sorry, Rebecca and Isaac. I mean, there's more of a equality there, and I think it's because, as I mentioned last week, their workplace and their home are the same thing, and they each have certain responsibilities together. And especially if the men had to go to war, then the women had to take over doing all the stuff, you know, on the farm or whatever. So their roles are not as distinct as they became in our society, you know. Patty, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that the women were not shrinking violets at all.
No.
Very perceptive about what needed to be done and what had to be done in order to do whatever it was that they knew.
Right. And again, you know, the ones who are portrayed as vixens and prostitutes and all that, when you look, that, you know, that or seductresses, Eve is not a seductress. Neither is Delilah. And so it's just really important to look at the text. And then also, of course, if you're going to look at the text, to be very clear about the fact that if you're reading a translation, that's already an interpretation. And be really careful about saying, well, the text says this. Well, really, what does it say in Hebrew? And even if you know the Hebrew, it's not always clear what the Hebrew means, right? So you have to be really, really careful about that. You know, oh, it says man was created. Well, it says Adam. Is that man? Is that Adam? Or is that a human being? So already there you have, you know, several choices to make. So I am going to do a class next week about the Akedah, about the binding of Isaac, and we're going to look at some poetry that are interpretations of the story. I mean, this story has been interpreted in so many ways. I could do probably, you know, 10 classes on it, but we're going to try to squeeze it into an hour and a half. So it'll be on Thursday again. This was just the 1 week that we changed it because of my husband's birthday. So thank you for indulging that. And we'll see you maybe tomorrow night at services, maybe a Torah study Saturday morning, and hopefully next Thursday. So good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.